Yancey, you're obviously a gifted preacher, and God has used that and will use that in your life. What are some principles you could give kind of from the preaching angle that would help some young guys get started as well?
You've got to figure out who you are as a preacher. We have a blessing and a cursing being a part of Acts 29 because we're surrounded by phenomenal teachers. And if you're a young guy in the game, so to speak, just trying to find your sea legs preaching wise, you can be easily overwhelmed by listening to the Chandlers and the Driscolls of the world and go, man, I just want to preach like that. And I think somewhat like with leadership, you got to figure out who you are and be comfortable with that and realize God's gifted you a certain way. I think a lot of young guys get jumped up as they want to preach but with someone else's personality. They don't have it. So I think you got to figure out what your personality is. And I can just tell you for me personally, I mean, I've been preaching for over a decade now, well over a decade, frankly, and I'm still wrestling with who I am because I so admire the guys around me. And Bruce is sandbagging himself a little bit. Bruce is a phenomenal teacher, and so I'll listen to Bruce and go, gosh, why can't I do it like that? Instead of just really finding my acceptance in the gospel and my identity there, and go, Yancey, God has gifted you with a certain personality, and you need to maximize those cylinders of that engine instead of trying to figure out, okay, what do I not have that I need to have? That's probably what comes to mind.
That's good. Well, tell us a little bit about your method. Like when you sit down to prepare a message, are you kind of like, I got one point and I want to say it, or are you like, there's 6 points here? How do you do what you do?
Unfortunately, it's a little different every time. What I would prefer to do is I want to find what's the main point of this passage. In fact, when Bruce and I teach expositionally, and right now we're going through Galatians as a church, we're trying to find what's the dominant truth in each. We divvy up, if you will, and separate the chunks of the book of Galatians by what's the dominant thought here. And so I'm trying to mine into that thought. I tend to be, and I've told you this off camera before, I tend to be intuitive in how I put together a message. And so for me, there has to be a feeling there. What I've told Bruce before is I'm trying to find the emotional center of the message. What I mean by that is every message is supposed to have a heartbeat. It can't just be this doctrinaire, distilled academic work that they trained me at seminary to do. It's got to, as Jonathan Edwards says, it has to aim at someone's affections. And so for me, I'm just trying to find what's the heart of this message. What's going to really, hopefully by God's grace, reach into the listener's heart and say, you know what, you need the gospel and you need to transform you. And so often I'll work through a text of Scripture, Galatians for example, and try to figure out, all right, how does this appeal to the person's affections, their heart? And if I'm not done until I find that, and that is a labor. I mean, sometimes it's not until Saturday afternoon, and I tend to work on my sermons really early. And I would encourage, especially young pastors, as hard as it may be, try to do your sermon work as early as possible for 2 reasons. Number one, if you're a church planter, I'm sure you got a million other things that are going to suck up the rest of your time. And number two, you've got to be able to, at least for me, I've got to kind of meditate on that throughout the week in case God frees me up to think of something at the end. But for me, trying to find the emotional center, one of the ways I think that happens, and I'll try to make this short, especially when you're working through a verse by verse through a passage of the Scriptures to figure out what's the emotion of the passage. I think often when we're trained to do expositional teaching, we think, what's the historical, grammatical context? I mean, we ought to do that. But unfortunately, we don't even think about the emotional context. And so much of what is written in the Bible, actually all of it, has some type of emotion tied to it. And so, for example, we're working through Galatians, and when Paul says, who has bewitched you? He's not just saying that in an academic fashion. I mean, you can tell he's bent because the gospel's not being lived out in the churches of Galatia. And so when I'm teaching, I'm just trying to tap into that emotion. And so I think, frankly, sometimes pastors do emotional eisegesis. Eisegesis is obviously where you kind of bring your own interpretation, make the text say something it doesn't need to say. I don't want to do that emotionally. I want to figure out if God inspired Paul to write these words, I tend to think he also inspired him to feel the way that he felt. And so Spurgeon once said, in defending the Bible, you don't have to defend the Bible. It's like a lion. You just let it out of its cage and it'll defend itself. I kind of feel the same way emotionally. I don't have to generate some emotion when I'm working through Galatians. I'm just trying to figure out, all right, what's the emotion that we see exuding and kind of bleeding all over these verses. I just need to unleash it. I need to unlock that verse or unlock that passage emotionally, and then I don't have to create anything. I don't have to generate anything. I just have to live it out.